Let's do it. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are around World War II. We are kind of slinging it into the home straightaway here of U.S. history, into the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement. Things are heating up. It's a good time to study U.S. history. I hope you're well. First and foremost, I hope there is nothing coronavirus that is in any way weighing on your family, those that you love. I saw a bunch of people yesterday on the Zoom conference. That was nice to see some folks. It's good to put some faces out there. I hope you're taking care of yourselves. Before we dive into the Cold War and the material, let's talk logistics. There was a written test portion due yesterday. There was a study guide portion due yesterday. I will get to grading those. I shall have them done sometime in the next handful of days. I apologize that it's not quicker than that, but there's quite a few of them to read. And at the same time, the school's keeping us pretty busy with other things to do as well. So the latest on school, just to kind of put 30 seconds there, we are out until May 5th. The school is driving buses around in neighborhoods to operate as rotating Wi-Fi spots. If you want to check out a Chromebook, you can do that through the school. Keep in mind, next week's your spring break. So as long as you've done all the work here, you should be able to enjoy some time on your spring break. Other than that, is there any more work this week? There's not. Watch this video, take notes, put it in a study guide, however you want to do it, and you are good for the period prior to the break. I won't see you with another video until we jump back in after spring break is over, okay? What else was I going to mention? For this unit on the Google Drive, the Google Classroom, I beg your pardon, I have listed three things. Number one, the study guide is there. Number two, you'll then find the slides are there for this unit. And number three, I have a Google Classroom spot that is the videos for this unit. As we get closer to the modern day, there's some sweet, short videos that are worthy of watching. There are not any in today's lesson, but as I go through them in other lessons, I will say, okay, go and grab the one that says Eisenhower's 1952 commercial. Okay? And then I'd like you to watch it. Preferably, if you can, I'd like you to watch it midstream here. I'd like you to be able to pause and then go watch it and then come back, because that's how it would work in a classroom. And those videos add a nice little morsel of sweetness to what we're doing. So we want to make sure we see those along the way. I also have a map today over on the side here. Sometimes I say things like, hey, we're in Korea, and people go, I'm pretty sure I know where Korea is, Holiday, but I'm not exactly sure. And it matters. And we're going to be all over the world today. We're going to be in, I suppose you could say we're in the United States and in the Soviet Union, but we are also, as a result of the Cold War, a lot in Western Europe and also in Asia. So I'm going to put aside my logistical agenda. Do you have to print out the study guide? Preferably. But let's be fair, if you don't and if you can't, then taking notes would be fine. I will do something like I did last time, where I asked you for portions of the study guide to make sure that we're doing things along the way. But you don't have to print it out. I personally would want to print it out, but as I said, I realize if there are reasons that you can't print it out, and I also understand if you can't get out and get ink and whatnot, and we shouldn't be going out unnecessarily to do those things. So I don't want to put people into hairy spots and anything like that. Whatever works for you that shows me that you're watching this and running along with the material, you're gold. Any questions on it, hit me up. I'll get back to you quick. All right, let's go. The Cold War. The Cold War is the name given to the conflict between the two surviving superpowers of World War II. Imagine how the world has switched. Prior to 1939, if you're listing the great powers of the world, the two countries that we talk about predominantly today are probably not on the list. And if they are, they're down the scale. The largest powers are the Germans, the British, the French, the rising Japanese of the Far East, perhaps even China because of its size. Maybe Italy, they're a little bit more tangential there. But let's be fair, all of those countries are rubble. That is what they are. And left, standing atop, are the Soviet Union, which to its credit is a lot of rubble as well, and the United States, which, although it has a lot of domestic things going on during World War II, largely walks onto the stage of 1945 unscathed on the home front. Compare the number of dead. 27 million Soviets are dead roughly 400,000 Americans are dead. That is a whopping difference. The United States can say we spent a whole lot more money. We helped a lot of people fight this war. The Soviets are going to say, on the other hand, we did the dying. So what we have here is an ideological contest between two surviving powers whose basic tenets of understanding the world are completely different. What I mean by that is they should have understood that this would lead to a misunderstanding. It has to. The democratic, capitalist United States of America and the authoritarian socialist Soviet Union are radically different ideals. And while we had a common foe, that is to say, let's kill Hitler, we got along. But once that foe was removed from the table, it's hard to imagine that the two characters can continue to be good friends. And the animosity between them is going to rise, sometimes slowly, and during this period, quite quickly. How do we fight the Cold War? Largely through rhetoric, that is to say, we talk smack about one another. The United States talks about the freedom, the opportunity, the greatness of the West. The Soviets tout their system. Now, in our brains as Americans, we are quick to look at the Soviets and go, we know how this one ends. Fast forward to 1989, we'll see it all crumble and your system died. The Soviets in 1945 would have said to you, give us some credit, please. What have we done? Well, here's one. We destroyed a lot of the Nazi army. You have to give us credit for that one. And number two, we, the Soviets, the Bolsheviks that led the Soviet Union, took a backward, antiquated 17th century Russia and turned it into a 20th century powerhouse. There must be something to us. Now, American critics would say, yeah, I don't know about those claims, guys. Let's be fair, you only advanced the nation because Stalin decided to kill 20 million of his own people, and we don't know if we like that system of living. The Soviets, for that matter, would look at America and say, freedom? Tell it to the African Americans. Tell it to the minorities of the country. Are they really free? Stalin is quick in any conference he has with Roosevelt or later on with Truman to point out that America lives up to this idea of freedom when it suits it, that it perhaps doesn't always toe the line on freedom and opportunity. Now, an American's going to respond and be like, as compared to you? As compared to the Soviet Union where you get shot for speaking? Gah. Okay, so there's a lot of anger there. You also fight it by stockpiling weapons. As we'll see here, eventually both these nations will have atomic weapons and they'll begin to build a lot of them. And by proxy wars. And that's what today is largely about, is proxy. In other words, the use of American money, military power, and influence in order to fund a regime that is going to be challenged by the Soviet Union and their money and military resources and influence in other places. That is to say, take the Korean War, for instance. The Korean War is going to turn out being this massive conflict of the Cold War. But during the Korean War, for decades and decades, most people believed that an American had never gone head-to-head with a Soviet. It was a proxy war. It was American influence in South Korea against Soviet influence in North Korea, fighting against one another. Now, interestingly enough, not to get too far ahead of yourself, Holiday, but recent archival footage shows that there were Soviet pilots in North Korean planes during the Korean War, and so therefore there were head-to-head combats between Americans and Soviets. But that is a small detail, Holiday. Most of the time in proxy wars, it isn't America versus the Soviet Union. It's America's proxy, or its regime that it's influencing, and the Soviet Union's proxy going head-to-head. All right? We believe, as the United States, that the Soviets are bent on expansion. We believe that that is the nature of their idea. And, in all fairness, it is. That's exactly what it is. The Soviet Union is built on the notion of a worldwide revolution, not of a revolution in one country. The Soviets are an expansive power. And the United States believes that we must practice containment. That's the key word of today, containment of the Soviet Union. Everywhere the Soviet Union attempts to expand its influence, we and our power must be there to stop it. If you go with the idea of domino theory, which isn't a phrase that anyone's chucking around until the 1950s, any domino falling to the power of the Soviet Union or to the socialist ideas matters, because that domino could then topple another domino. It doesn't matter how small the domino is. It doesn't matter if we're talking about a large nation, say for instance, India. It doesn't matter if we're talking about a small one, Vietnam. Anytime a Soviet-influenced country is pushing, and that was a domino right there, pushing against another one, that's the opportunity for a domino to fall. And we, the United States, have to be right here, right there, to prop up that domino, okay? All right. In your slides, we go from this Cold War slide over to the Truman Doctrine slide in 1947. Yeah, and you're going to say, whoa, there's like a couple of years, big jump in there, Holiday. Yeah, as far as the major events of the Cold War, this is the first couple of moments of real animosity. In other words, for the first couple of years after World War II, everyone's a little bit copacetic. Everyone's getting along. And then things start to happen. In 1947, two countries that up until then had been friends of Great Britain, Turkey and Greece. Where are Turkey and Greece, Holiday? I know not. Let me show you. There. Oh, that's too close, Holiday. There's Turkey, just there. There's Turkey. Okay, and Greece is right next door. Okay, so the Soviet Union is pretty close. Okay? Turkey and Greece are countries that prior to this had relied upon Great Britain for economic and military assistance. The British are a crumbled thing after World War II. They simply do not have the economic resources that are going to be necessary in order to support regimes like these former friends. Likewise, their colonies, for that matter. Britain is going to come out of World War II largely having been known for the last hundreds of years as the colonial superpower. That's over. You don't have the sort of money you need to be that kind of an organizer of people, that is to say, running an empire. It's over. And so Britain comes to the United States and in essence says, we can't afford these people anymore. And there are pressures going on inside of the country and pressures being exerted on the outside of the country that are trying to pull them towards the socialist ideal. And this is where Truman, for the first time, really begins to hew out what becomes American containment ideology. Truman puts forward an idea that the United States should be there for any country, anywhere, at any time that is opposing forces of interior or exterior pressure. Truman uses pretty vague language here. He's not going to say this is anti-Soviet Union money, but he does use the word free or freedom, let me check my notes, 24 times in an 18-minute speech. Truman realizes that if he has to sell this idea to the American people, he must do so by putting it in the most basic of American terms, freedom. That's what this is. This is about the freedom of the people of Turkey and Greece. And if they do not get this money, which would allow their country to fight back against the Soviet Union and against socialist pressures, that they will be a domino that falls to the Soviet order. Truman is clear about this. Now, to Truman's credit, this passes, Turkey and Greece get $400 million, and the regime stays in place. Now, the Soviets would say, wait a moment, maybe that regime, I beg your pardon, is not 100% great. Fair point. It might have its warts as well. But we in America are going to see this as the better outcome. Notice the couple of images I have here. I want to point them out. If you're not looking at the slides, it might help you to look at the slides for a moment. There's a couple of political cartoons here. The one in the bottom left is a little more straightforward. You have Stalin, who smoked a pipe, smoking this pipe, and then we jam the Truman Doctrine in it, and it kind of stuffs up the pipe, and he can't smoke his pipe anymore, and he's like, ooh, he's like coughing all over the shop. That's pretty funny, Holiday. I know. The one that I think is more in line with how America feels, though, is the one in the upper right. I have a blindfolded Uncle Sam. Notice the blindfold. Walking out onto a log over troubled waters, you can tell. And it says, New American Foreign Policy. Uncle Sam's got a stick going, he's got the blindfold, and a bag of money, aid to Turkey and Greece. And you think to yourself, where are we headed? And that's what Americans at that moment were thinking. If you imagined that World War II had been all the money you needed to spend and all the commitment you needed to make, then what happens in the Truman Doctrine has you feeling a little apprehensive. Hence Uncle Sam in this position. What's that weird character all the way over on the right? Holiday looks like a little frog or something. That's meant to be a little character of Harry Truman. Truman had a really pronounced set of glasses in the front of his face, so it stuck out a little bit like this little buggy almost. And so when you draw Truman, you draw him in order to emphasize that. That's the caricature way, right? In the same way that President Trump always has like a big whoof of hair, like a skateboarding ramp worth all the way up his head there, okay? So, Truman Doctrine, trying to contain communism with American finances. It works, okay? Same sort of idea as I switch myself over to the Marshall Plan. Marshall, American Secretary of State, and prior to that, General of the Army, George C. Marshall, comes up with this idea to do what we had done in Turkey and Greece for the rest of Western Europe. You can see in the image how much money we're talking about here. Ridiculous amounts of money, but let's be honest about what the land looks like. In 1947 and 48, most of the Western European countries had not recovered from World War II. They remained largely in rubble. Their economies were shattered. Their people were still on rationing systems. My mother and father were both born in this part of the world during that period. My dad was born in 1944, my mother in 1945. My mom will tell you that in the years prior to them leaving England and moving to Southern Africa, that she remembers food rations all the way until she was about 8 or 9 years old in the early 1950s, that the system of rationing that Britain had adopted in order to cope with the emergency of World War II in 1939 and 1940, those remained in place for a decade and a half. That'll show you the scarcity of goods in that area. Why am I telling you this? Because Marshall wants this to be a program that isn't just about fighting communism. When Marshall puts forward the Marshall Doctrine here, or the Marshall Plan, I beg your pardon, he's talking about basic human needs. When Truman gave that speech about the need for money in Turkey and Greece, he was talking about freedom, and he really hammered freedom. What Marshall wants to talk about is hunger and poverty. And he thinks the world needs to understand that America's greatest foe here, and really humankind's greatest foe, is want. That's what we have to overcome. So the money given out by the Marshall Plan is free money. This is money you will never have to repay, and it is money intended to rebuild your society. It's money without any sort of a tendered offer in the sense that you have to pay us that money back. It's offered to any European country, including the Soviet Union. Marshall, you funny human being. Marshall communicates with Stalin, and he's like, hey, Joe, you need money, Joe? Joe, you light? Need some cheddar? And of course, Stalin, who hates the United States and their capitalist culture, he can't take any of that money. He'd like to take that money. But he can't take that money, okay? But the United States, almost as a show of a little bit of largesse, as a way of looking like a baller, is going to be like, hey, I got money. I got money for all of you. You need money? You get some money. You get some money. With Oprah, that money all over the place. I get carried away a bit. I am sitting in my kitchen by myself, so you got to entertain yourself here. The point being that the plan is incredibly powerful economically. And just as a side tangent, this is exactly what we did in Japan as well. We walked into a rubbled society, and we rebuilt the economy, and we rewrote the Constitution, and we set them down on a track that today works perfectly well. Now, in the long run, these are going to become competitors. And perhaps you could say, man, that's bad. You funded the countries that eventually drove you out of the economic market. By 1970 or so, it's going to be the West Germans and the Japanese and the South Koreans that are making America obsolete in a production sense. That's okay, right? That's all right. That's a legacy we are happy to endure. If the countries that we help to rebuild and to remake become competitors and drive us away, we'll figure it out. Better that than they should fall under the boot of the Soviet enterprise, okay? By 1950, I wrote down some stats I want to share. By 1950, production in Western Europe was twice what it was before World War II. That's fantastic. Overall, this is considered to be one of the great moments of the Cold War, a humanitarian aid program, right? Stalin would say to you, that's not humanitarian aid. That's dirty capitalist money from the stinking United States. It still spends pretty well, Joe. Just saying. Okay? Moving along. Later that year, the closest we come to a scrap since World War II. The terrible situation in Berlin. Now, I have here, ladies and gentlemen, on the slide, a picture of the separated Germany. If you don't remember anything about this last year, if you have no background in it, no problem. But look at the map. I need us to look at the map in order to understand that the city that we're going to talk exclusively about here, Berlin, sits in that pink area, in the eastern part of Germany, not in the west. So although Berlin is a city co-owned by the British, the French, the United States, and the Soviets, the entire city itself sits in a sea of Soviet East Germany. That is right. It is surrounded. So how do we get to the West Berlin portions, Holiday? Roads and railroads. There are access routes that run through Soviet soil. Okay, that's what Stalin would have called it, those portions of East Germany, and into West Berlin. So West Berlin is this small area of Western ideals sitting among a sea of Sovietness, right? I used this quote last year. I'll use it again. It catches people's attention. Stalin always said that Berlin was the testicles of the West. It was the most exposed, most sensitive portion of the Western power. And if he ever needed to get the attention of the United States or the British or the French, all he had to do was apply pressure on West Berlin, and that would get the job done. And that's what's about to happen here. In early 1948, the three Western allies, the British, the French, and the United States, moved forward with a plan to consolidate their sectors of West Germany into one sector. Okay, so understand that the original plan here, the one we cracked out at Yalta, was to combine all four sections: Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. But it is clear at this point that that's not going to work. The Soviet portion of things is not nearly as rebuilt as the other three. The Soviets are not willing to follow the style of life that the people of the West want to follow, and therefore we're kind of going to leave them out. So as those three allies move forward with a plan to introduce a common currency and to introduce a common government over the western portion of Germany, Stalin gets upset. Stalin believes he's being left out, and as a reactionary move, he closes the access roads and railroads into the western portion of Berlin. Fine move, Stalin. You've really put us in a spot. What Stalin has done here is push the United States into a choice moment. Stalin is saying, I will take the people who live in West Berlin. I will take all 2 million souls because you guys did something without my permission. If you're Harry Truman, you got to make a choice here. You can't really just barge in. If you barge into that western, or I beg your pardon, that eastern portion of Germany, you're technically invading Soviet soil, and I don't want to start a war. Now, we do have an atomic bomb. They don't have an atomic bomb. We could do that. But you can't really just get in the practice of dropping bombs on people everywhere unless you're a well-known rapper. That doesn't work. So you have to come up with some other plan. And the other plan that Truman comes up with is the airlift. We will fly over the top of you, and we will land in the western portion of Berlin, and we will do so for as long as it takes. This will be our push of containment. You are not going to take the 2 million souls of West Berlin. We will defend these people. I don't care how much it costs. This is a show of American logistical support, also a sign of American wallets being thicker than Soviet wallets. And if I'm Stalin, this is a little bit of checkmate. There's not much I can do here. Truman has absolutely made me look a bit foolish. Truman's reversal of the moment here, taking kind of the moment and turning into a great moment for himself, makes the West look fantastic. Because Stalin can't shoot those planes down, after all. You can't shoot down a humanitarian mission. You'd look like a right tool. And so the United States is in a situation where we can continue to fly goods in there. Now, it's not easy. It's not cheap. And it's also a very dangerous thing to do. You know, a lot of people lose their lives on these missions. But the United States wants the people of West Berlin and the world to see that containment is a serious business. We simply won't be pushed out of this by Stalin and his exercises, okay? Eventually, Stalin's going to back down. Now, that leads us, pardon me as I flip my page, we're on to our next slide here, to the creation of an alliance between the Western states of Europe and the United States against the Eastern ones, what we call the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, a group of collective security. Now, collective security is a term we've had before. That was the term that they used in the League of Nations discussion that upset so many of the American senators, and that's why they didn't want to join the League of Nations. But this time, collective security is going to be sold as a way to protect people in Western Europe, people like France and West Germany and West Berlin and Britain from the Soviet Union. The United States is not on this map, I understand that, but if it was on this map, you would see that it's highlighted the right color. If you're looking at it in color here, it'd be that kind of minty looking green. And on the other hand, the Soviet Union is organizing its empire into a collective security pact called the Warsaw Pact. Really, you have two armed sides, both of whom are willing to do everything that's possible in order to defend, when necessary, against aggression. Now, NATO is still around today. NATO today does things like assure that countries that are in the Baltic states are not pressured by the Russians. Okay, so to sort of fast forward this to the future, NATO has evolved from being, let's say, anti-Soviet Union expansion to now being anti-Russia expansion. I suppose you could say it's kind of the same animal holiday, just a different fur, I guess. But really what I'm looking at here is a long-term American commitment to the freedom of the people of Western Europe. Really one of the times that the president, during easier times, let's say, the president got himself in a little bit of trouble early on in his presidency because he's really straightforward, the president is. You know, sometimes he says things that people have been wanting to say for a while and they just couldn't say them. So one time, I'm going to be dramatic here. The president had a meeting with Angela Merkel. Merkel is the leader of Germany and kind of the strong central post. She's the strongest leader in Europe. So he was meeting with her, and they were going to talk about NATO budgets. And the Germans are members of NATO. And one of the caveats, one of the parts of the NATO agreement is that you have to spend a certain percentage of your gross domestic product on defense. That's one way of making sure we're all doing our part. And Trump walked in, the president, I beg your pardon, walked in with a sheet of paper, and he's like, here's the bill. That's how he started the meeting. And Merkel was like, oh. And really what he was saying is Germany, for the last 20, 25 years, has been spending far lower than the required NATO percentage. And by doing so, you're requiring the United States to spend far more of our percentage. Right? It's a moment where, in all fairness, the president has a point. You joined the team, Germany. You agreed to spend that kind of money, but you're not spending it on that. So while you're busy telling the United States that we don't have enough money, you're forcing us to spend more money on your defense. So maybe you should pick up the slack. That's a long aside story. I understand. But what I'm trying to demonstrate is the notion of collective security and how over time it evolves. And it becomes something that it wasn't intended to be. We never imagined that it was going to be trying to defend Lithuania from the Russians, but that's part of what it is, or the Ukraine for that matter. Sip of coffee, pardon me. If I'm Truman, I'm rolling. I get reelected in 1948, although it's a really close election. In fact, if you've ever seen it, there's these newspaper headlines where the Chicago Tribune prints the fake headline that he was defeated. It says, Dewey defeats Truman. And they had basically called the election too early, and Truman goes on to win the election. So it's a close one, but he wins. I did that whole Berlin airlift thing. That was good. I had the Truman Doctrine. Feeling pretty good about myself here. Marshall Plan went well. That's right. We have NATO now. We stood up against Stalin. I'm presidenting pretty well. And then it all goes. Tatters. 1949, the year it changes. Okay, moving on to my next slide here. In 1949, after a long struggle, the Chinese nationalist government, the one that we had been a benefactor of and we had been a supporter of, loses and is driven out of mainland China, and the new government, the socialist-led government of Mao Zedong, yeah, I did my best, okay, becomes the new government of China. Now, that really isn't our fault, but it is a sign of a crack in the armor. We're not supposed to lose. And Truman has, and this becomes the phrase, lost China. Now, in saying that we lost China, it assumes that we had it at some point. And I'm not sure that we really had it. But Truman, unfortunately for him, has not given enough money. Now, we have given a lot, billions, to this nationalist government trying to help it fight off the socialist forces. And unfortunately, we failed there. And as a result of it, China is going to fall to, that's the phrase we'll use, fall to, the Soviet Union or the socialist ideals, and then quickly become friends with, we should point out for right now, the Soviet Union. Why do we point this out? Because it's a sign that all of this containment talk isn't hollow. There is a legitimate issue with the expansion of socialist ideals. So if I'm an American looking at a map, pardon me, here comes the map again. If I'm an American looking at a map, I was looking at a world where this whole thing here, the Soviet Union, that was socialist. And then this whopping neighbor country of it just became socialist too. My goodness, it's expanding. We should contain it. And that's what we're trying to do. So for a long time, the United States has a very tense relationship with China. That's something that we really won't fix until the 1970s. We'll call upon Richard Nixon to do that work there. More on Nixon down the road. But for now, the United States feels as though we lost one there. And then, later that year, the United States finds out that the Soviets have tested their first atomic bomb. Oh. We thought that was going to happen somewhere in the mid-1950s. We thought we had a little more breathing room, where we would be able to stockpile more weapons, and we knew the Soviets didn't have the capability yet, but apparently we were wrong about that. So all of a sudden, Truman is looking a little bit on the ropes. You've lost China. The Soviets have the bomb. Mr. Truman, what are you doing? You asleep at the switch, Harry? Seems like you're not doing enough. Seems like you really don't have much of a place here. Okay, let's stay in Asia for a moment. In the background of this, and we're going to begin here a long discussion of Vietnam. Hold on, I'm just moving the slide here so we can see there. There we go. Okay. We begin here this pretty drawn-out American involvement in Vietnam or Indochina. Okay, this is one of the areas of the world where the United States is sending money over the course of the Cold War, and Truman is the first, so that's why we're starting here with Truman. Okay, I want to just make sure we understand where we are on a world map. Right there. Okay, that country that is on the edge, pardon me for not hovering perfectly here, but that country that is on the edge of Indochina there, that hanging right there, that is Vietnam. Neighbors, we should point out to China, okay, but otherwise sitting here, it's a long, kind of skinny, peninsular almost country, okay? But why are we there, Holiday? Why do we need to be there? This becomes the big question of American foreign policy for the next 30 years. What are we doing in Vietnam? And I say it in a little bit of a somber tone because once we get ourselves stuck in Vietnam, it is incredibly difficult to find our way back out. Truman begins America's relationship in Vietnam out of courtesy and friendship to the French. Now, I didn't think we owed the French anything, Holiday. Well, we're trying here. We are trying to build a world coalition of anti-socialist ideas, and the French are a friend in that battle. They're a friend of ours in Europe, they're a friend in the NATO coalition, and they are trying to colonize this territory as part of their own. You see, the French have this idea that they are still all that and a bucket of chips. They're not, unfortunately. The French are losing their colonial empire, much like the British, and the French are stubborn about it. They simply don't want to give up on the idea of colonization. Okay, they are losing colonies they already had, like northern African ones, like Algeria. That's one that they'll lose in the 1950s and 60s. But they also are getting into the colonial game in order to find new spots. Ugh, new spots? Yes. This territory that we call Vietnam, that they called French Indochina, and I have a map of it on the slide too, you can see it there, is a territory that was occupied by the Japanese prior to World War II. It was part of Japanese expansion in the area. Now, earlier than that, it was part of Chinese territorial holding. You see, the Vietnamese people have a long established history of simply outweathering you. We've done this before. And this is what America is going to find out the hard way, unfortunately. Over centuries, they resisted the Chinese, and then they resisted the Japanese, and then they're going to resist the French. And when America comes along in the 1950s and says, hey, we're here to stabilize the area, the Vietnamese are going to be like, we know how to handle this. And they're going to get absolutely into their tactics they've been using for centuries and twist the world's greatest industrial military superpower into a knot. And it all starts with us trying to help out a friend, the French. The French think this is going to be a colonial stronghold for them. One of the places that when you're sitting in Paris and someone says, the French, you guys don't have anything. You guys are a yesterday's power. The French can say, oh, no, my friend, look at the flag in Vietnam. Look at it. Oh, you Americans, you're all the same. And then they can say, well, we're really powerful. Okay, good. So how are we going to help you out? We're going to send you money. We're going to send you money in order to prop up the French regime there. So this is the price we pay for being a power in Europe